grew up in this in a very small rural Ontario town called Deloro. It's the second gold mining town in Ontario. Deloro being Spanish for Valley of Gold. And it was a very strange situation, almost Lynchian. Lynchian combined with To Kill a Mockingbird. So there's archetypical kind of relations to these. Anyways, I'm getting off topic, but it was just this small, almost like a suburban street in the middle of nowhere, which of course were the workers' houses to the mine. And the mine shut down, I'd say, in the early 30s, so it was quite a, I'd say, almost idyllic tree-lined street scenario, very bucolic, and of course the mine itself was, abandoned, so it became this huge, almost my first encounter with something on an urban scale. The buildings were all industrial buildings and all left, basically completely abandoned. So I would spend a lot of time foraging through there. It was almost like walking into the set of Tarkovsky's Stalker, because these places were just, like they were desks with papers still on them. So for me, it became a vehicle for projecting into this as a place of fantasy, and I think that's when I first started taking photographs, and then starting to develop some idea. And in many ways, it's kind of the aesthetics of the ruin have stuck with me. So I consider that to be a very formative component to my growth and development. It was quite early on, and I think it stems out of adolescence and also stimulation that you received during that period. For me, it was always an interest in the arts in general, not necessarily the visual arts, but and at that time, this is when I I wax nostalgically about the CBC and its function in my life at this point, because it was quite an integrity-driven programming that was occurring with the shows, and there was a late-night broadcast called Brave New Waves, which was a 5-hour program that would go from 11 p.m. till 4 a.m. And I remember buying a double-deck cassette tape so I could record the whole thing and then listen to it the next day. And for me, I was growing up in a very small community in a rural area, so there wasn't a lot of access to information. The libraries were small, et cetera, so you had to seek this stuff out and then kind of formulate preferences or things that would provoke you or excite you. And I would often condense those tapes into one mixtape and then just seek out information on these artists and things like this. So this, in tandem with some literature, and I was doing quite a bit of writing as an adolescent as well. So for me, it was just this kind of ethereal, kind of formless shape of attractions that was occupying my mind. And at the time it wasn't necessarily defined, but I had always been active with drawing and things like this. And so it just gradually, almost naturalistically, announced itself with when I went to art school. And then, from there on, it was just perseverance and a lot of stubbornness and large ambitions and dreams that consumed me and still do, in fact. And at this point, I feel like there's really, you get so deeply into it, there's no turning back, So for me, it's just been just a way of life. I consider it to be an honor, in fact, and I feel very lucky that this is what I've chosen as my path in life. I'm really, basically creating my own world and creating my own set of rules, and it's it's a construction. It's an entire ecosystem that falls into place from there, and you live accordingly.
Indeed. Somewhere in there, I'm curious about what you thought an artist does, or what your concept of an artist might be, and whether that's changed. Of course, it would have changed.
Right.
To become professional, but and perhaps going back to the beginning and then moving forward to the current moment where you are professional.
Yeah.
This question of what an artist does, or
right.
is supposed to do.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, again, going back to those early recordings, a lot of the specific artists I was drawn to were the dial-a-poem poets with William Burroughs recordings and things like this. And so, for me, and that, of course, led in tandem with reading their writing and everything. And for me, the image of what they were proposing as an artist was this agitator, provocateur, and a reliance on experimentation and poetic agency. And I still feel that in many ways that these are the type of artists that I'm drawn to. These are the type of figures that I admire. An insistence on experimentation and basically that's where I lose my train of thought for a second there. Sorry.
Let me on the question of what artists do, or
yes, thank you.
I think you answered that, but I'm kind of curious about a quote that has been, at least a summary quote that has been an attempt, I guess, to describe your work. And it seems to follow on what you just said, which is that your work seeks to infect culture through the tenuous nature of its prototypes.
Oh.
There you go. What do you think?
I think that, I'm not sure, I think perhaps maybe I ghost wrote that at some point. Yeah, I think that, and again, it's like we're always kind of sampling from culture, or we're surrounded by stimulation and effects and ephemera and objects, and again, part of that is the models that are put forth by other artists' work. So those prototypical kind of I guess units get utilized as a much larger field of language that you can cultivate from, and get put into motion by the nature of your own, by generating your own type of motion or your own negotiation of these ideas or stimulations in your own work. So.
There's another phrase that's been applied, which is entropic mud, or at least the concept of entropy.
Yes, yeah. This is something that I think that was preoccupying me quite in a more direct way with my earlier work. I think in specifically with works that I was doing around the year 2000, and there was a piece I did at Plug-in in Winnipeg, which consisted of a very large drop ceiling. The ceiling panels were transparent plexiglass, over which I poured an absurdist concoction of syrups and cements and fruit spreads, which were all cooked up in this vat and then poured over the ceiling. The piece was called The Soup. So again, there's this kind of primordial reference point, but there was also something about putting something into motion without an expectation so that it generates its own activity. And in fact, these things, they would kind of crystallize and form these stalactites and from the ceiling, and I think there was another piece that I was more or less, I think I was more aligned with this as an idea, in a performative way at this point in my career, and I was also negotiating what sculpture was, and I think at that point the differential was with what would be termed installation art, which I think is, I think that's a phrase invented by critics to let people off the hook of sculpture. So it's like, so I still consider this to be quite, loosely ensconced in the idea of objecthood, despite its unwieldy scale and its unwieldy status as an object in relation to the spectator. And then that has just gradually curtailed itself more emphatically with a very succinct negotiation of the object itself. And that, I guess, the only resistance I have about the idea of entropy is there's a certain forlorn association with it. And I would admit that what I'm engaged in right now is quite existential, but not necessarily sad. And I'm basically involved in an extended dialogue of creating, experimenting, and sustaining multiple ideas as objects, and then their agglomeration. So that is another form of like an entropic force in itself, just that it's not something that I seek out consciously, it's something that happens quite organically, and something that is, intuited in the process of the studio itself. So I think that what's happened is, just in a more clear way, just the movement from using the space as the vehicle to the object as so it's this inversion to the object in a way. So I guess it still applies to a degree, yes.
Well, maybe try another phrase out on you, which is anti-decorating.
Anti-decorating, oh, that's funny. I don't know where that one came out from, but I do know that there's this great passage in Welbeck's Possibility of an Island, wherein the protagonist is playing an artist, and he achieves grand success on very little talent, but he does have this one great phrase, and he says, basically there are two types of artists, the revolutionaries and the decorators. And I would have to say that I'm a bit of both. There's certainly aspects of both that, again, it goes back to this idea of sampling and what you were just mentioning with regards to the prototypes in culture and those prompts, and so that can occur just in the use of a found object or the use of paint, patterns, things like this, but things that basically create a force of collisions that rub up against one another. So, yeah, anti-decorating, I guess.
I was going to ask you about 3 points, but here we are in the studio, and we have the work inescapably around us.
Yes.
And I wonder if you want to talk about, points, or whether you prefer to talk about the show that's coming up at Twin
3 more points, it's a blur into this work, actually, so it's certainly relevant. And I think you're referring to the work I did in Berlin, primarily, and this was actually quite a turning point in my investigations and evolution, and something occurred there, and I think that was actually the first time I felt that it was emphatically grounded in the autonomous object, and that was really my only goal during that period of production, was to negotiate that. And then something started to occur that it awoken a sense of an uncanny relation to the object, and there was something that started to resemble figuration, and I was almost a little bit shaken by it. It wasn't necessarily a conscious maneuver, but by the nature of their status as a vertical object in relation to the body, there is irrevocably, you know, there is a resemblance or a relation or a resonance with the body, and then they started to almost become caricatures in a weird way. So I felt like they started to, it was almost this Frankenstein moment where they started to emerge as figures. And I remember actually once being in the midway and I was like talking about this with my dear friend Kristen Horton, and he said, "Oh yeah, and that's great, and this one has an eye and it's actually crying." And I was like, and I remember being quite upset with him at that point, because I was like, "No, it doesn't." And then of course these things, this is part of, there's one aspect of my work that deals with the material process, but then there's the evolution of form, and it's becoming, and then it's recognition in the mind as a conceptual process that gets embraced or rejected or what have you. And so this is something that I felt like there was a notion of figuration that I hadn't anticipated, and then it was a funny thing that once I became conscious of it, I started to build the work with this in mind, and then it became almost like then I started using actual figurative elements. For instance, with this work, I've cast a lot of like boots and cast into some jeans. There's a lot of definitively figurative components in this work, but I've almost taken the position of trying to bury them again, so that they are actually trying to, they're gravitating more to a condition of abstraction by the sum of their parts, which are figurative, whereas the other work, which was attaining some kind of figuration through the sum of abstract parts. So this is kind of push and pull, and a play, and a dance with all these elements that they're, you know, it's a bit of a, this is probably the longest period of time that I've spent on this one singular strain of investigation as well. So it's and I consider it to be in, you know, it's not really ending, so I don't know where it's going, but I'm left with a bunch of like junkyard jack-and-edges or something, and now they feel like they're starting to emerge into more, I'm looking at a lot of like plant formations as, so this all is in tandem with looking at the history of sculpture, and you know, like this whole foot right here, it's almost like the first step on the moon, but it's like definitely engaged with the notion of a contrappasto. I mean, very basic sculptural, almost classical sculptural concerns. So, did that manage to actually answer that question?
I'm sure it did.
Okay.
Well, you know, it's, I don't know if this is a fair question, but as one talks about work, often it occurs to one that there is something at the core, some sort of core concern or interest. And of course, that to state only that is to misrepresent the larger picture of the work. But would you imagine that there's a core interest that would connect?
Well, I mean, there is a core interest, but it's more like a core activity. And for me, that activity is definitively ensconced in not only the idea of process, but actual process. So for me, this is where it becomes more of a fluvial concern, and something that is more. It has a liquidity that can, you know, become the umbrella for so many other concerns. And I'm not trying to be evasive in terms of thematics or things like that, because those things do shift naturalist in a natural way. But there's I mean, really, it's just, I would say it's just firmly ensconced in the whole activity and idea of process of building things, pulling them apart, putting them back together. And I mean, for me, it's just and this is something that preoccupies me with the idea of sculpture, is just its unwieldy status as an object, as something that you have to walk around. It almost has a subversive force, like it denies any two-dimensional notion of an image, because you can't really, you have to contain that in your mind as you walk around it. So for me, it feels like this very kind of, has this kind of subversive agency to it that can only be activated in a real space with the viewer. And this is something that I spend hours just pacing in the studio. In fact, it's like kind of like my little exercise treadmill or whatever. There's probably many kilometers paced out in the course of a night in the studio, because for me it has to survive from every point of view. And it has to be, or at least be a provocation from every point of view. And this is something that I came into contact with in my first visit to Rome with the work of Bernini, the Magnificence of Bernini, and his Four Seasons work in one of the piazzas. It was so lovely to see not only the subject of this sculpture, but the subject immersed within its mise en scene, its ground, and that also being as much, if not more, a conveyor of, or how he would entice the viewer to move around the space. So those kind of so-called like banal or interstitial moments within the sculpture are actually something that prompts a kind of a more cinematic response, if one could put it that way. But so I guess this is where I'm at right now. This is where I've been at for the last 5 years, and it's something that I seem to be. I wouldn't say there's definitely no level of complacency with regards to this as a concern, but.
You have talked, I think, to this subject, the subject of art history, and I'm not sure if you want to pursue that at all, your interest in art history, the history of modernism perhaps, deeper history such as Bernini. Is there anything that strikes you in particular about art history that is important to you?
Just work that affirms the audacity of the individual, and it's the artist that takes the chance or investigates a very trippy notion and fulfills it as a work is, for me, it's miraculous too. And when one encounters that work, it's an affirmation, it's encouragement, it's inspiration. So all of those things are really just contributing to a much larger background radiation that you can only hope to aspire to. So this is always. I wouldn't say it in a more I couldn't index it in a more specific way, but just in a kind of more ethereal way, that it's always present, and it's always quite a nice comfort.
Nice. I'll move along to some other questions. I'm just wondering, it often comes up that people assume that there's a zeitgeist or a dominant discourse. Of course, if we got to art history, we look back to the 1960s and the dominance of minimalism, for instance, or conceptualism. And it's often said that somehow there doesn't seem to be a zeitgeist or dominant discourse at the moment. but perhaps there is.
I think it's actually a very exciting time right now. Excuse me, because I think in particular there's no dominant discourse. It feels like a bit of a free-for-all, and it actually feels like an extended period of crisis. And those are the most exciting times, historically, artistically, where there are no definitive rules, there are no definitive tastes, or if they are, they happen in more discrete ways, or discreetly visible ways. But,
I think that it's a period. I'm going to go back to a model that I found quite useful, which is Lyotard's notion of the cyclical nature of practice and theory.
mm-hmm.
And I think that we're in that, and I think you expressed it quite nicely, in that particular point of crisis when the verities, the formal reifications are slipping away because they become overused, or they become so well defined that we don't need to attend to them any longer. And then there's a search for what lies behind it, or what could be seen as a progression from it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that period of crisis, a crisis of definition and value, I guess,
Right.
that offers the prospect for something to be built in the future.
Wow.
And maybe not.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a nice.
I've always pictured it in the sense that this is a moment of crisis, but crisis in the sense that the forms that were recognized through modernism, the ideologies and social structures, whether it's within art or architecture, have been deconstructed.
Yes. Yeah.
And once they're deconstructed, there is a reconstruction, and that is a very slow process until eventually you get to a point where you recognize the new form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Once you start recognizing the new form, you name it.
Yeah.
But once it's named, it starts the new cycle again.
Yeah.
You know, of the, questioning that name, questioning its identity. Because in the meantime, all social structures, technological discoveries, philosophical positions are shifting.
Yeah.
So when you bring all those things together, every new reconstruction absorbs those. You know? So that, and I think,
it's a nice notion of motility, and this kind of, there's like many aspects of one's work, and then you can apply it to a larger cultural gesture, and this difference between potential and possibility. And like, for instance, an athlete will they'll discuss potential, because they do have a limit, they have their body, and it can be evolved or heightened in a performative way, but there is a limit. Whereas artists talk about possibility. And this is a very nice notion that extends from Deleuze, and this idea of implicating possibility, which I think is really fantastic. So,
Deleuze. As much as artists are in practice, of course we also know and have known for decades that we're also within theory. Consequently, there has been a heightened interest in theory over the last 2 or 3 decades.
Yes.
And Deleuze, of course, is one of the famous names that pops up in theory.
Yeah.
But there are others. But my question is more general than trying to concentrate on one theorist or another. Just the question is, to what extent do you read theory, or does theory appear behind the work?
It does, and actually that's a good way to put it, and it appears behind the eyes. And for me, it's I'm not an academic, but I'm very much drawn to, well, specifically Deleuze. I'm a huge fan of Deleuze, and I like his work because it acts as a provocation. So I will read it in many ways the same way I would read poetry, and I see it as having a kind of poetic agency, specifically with the way he writes. It's a very generous form of writing that opens up options in the mind and possibilities in the mind. It never seems to really shut down, and in fact, I think that's like specifically his the thrust of his argument is just to sustain this, and then this also becomes a point of view on life itself and a way of living, and so there's many aspects of his thinking that inform my own, or at least reinforce my own concerns, and even his insistence on levity, levity as a potent force, we need to. There's actually many aspects when, for instance, when I talked about pacing around the work and seeing, or trying to glean its satisfaction from multiple points of view. There's also, I tend to talk out loud when I'm in the studio to myself, and there's many times when I'm saying, no, that's just too heavy, and that's like, that's just not, so I do kind of align myself with a lot of his thoughts and others as well, and not specifically Deleuze, but yeah, so it's there again, like as a kind of form of background radiation. I mentioned this phrase before, but it's it's just kind of enveloped in a more ethereal way, in a concrete way. So I'm not taking ideas and applying them directly or anything like that.
Humor is something, of course,
it's a humorless answer to a question about humor.
There you go. What could be better? And humor is one of those tricks that can bring a general audience in, whereas serious discourse
yes,
can seem somewhat frightening.
Yeah.
So how do you see your relationship to the general public, to the general audience, let's say? Does humor seem one of the channels that...
I guess I haven't really considered it so specifically, but it is definitely a channel, it's a valve, it is an opening, all of those things. So there's a point of accessibility, like that it actually is one of the great communicators. And Chaplin was one of the, he's... was that a gun?
It was.
It really sounded like a gun, didn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Chaplin.
So I'm not sure if I'll be staying in Detroit much longer, but... Sorry, what was that? Yes, Chaplin. And there was he was like he's inarguably one of the greatest comedians of all time, but he said something that I made them laugh when all I wanted to do was make them cry. And so he was obviously quite attuned to this notion of the vehicle of humor as the conveyor of tragedy, or so I think that even though it becomes you said trick, it is a kind of trick in a way, but it's something that it's also a skill that has to be attended to and heightened and honed consistently. So.
Which is what a clown does.
Yeah.
A stand-up comedian.
Yeah.
Do you see a relationship to certain parts of the practice?
Yeah, when I'm in the studio at 3 a.m. and quite tired, I feel quite clownish, and and I guess in many ways this is my audience. My sculptures are the reciprocal force of the audience. So
They're very performative.
Yes, they are, aren't they? Yeah.
I want to come back briefly again to the public, and of course, as you were saying, humor can be one route by which the public can be entered into the argument of the work. But there are other routes as well that you build into the work. Would you care to expand on what you imagine the public and how the public can enter into the work, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think I've touched upon it earlier just simply by the status of the object. And I mean, in a way, I'm trying to be both spectator and artist when I'm making the work, and I'm trying to negotiate. Well, you can never predict how it's going to be received, but I'm trying to negotiate if there's any weak links or anything with regards to all the different perspectives upon the work itself. So, I mean, this is something just really, I mean, just things that I would consider notions of the public are quite abstract. They're more like, again, they feel more like weather patterns of circulation and things like this. And then if by chance you are connecting with someone, you know, it's always such a wonderful situation that I mean, ultimately you feel like the work is completed when it's communicated. So when you have that resonance with another, or with the other, it's a very gratifying moment, for sure. Yeah.
Do you find yourself speaking as much as to the general public to other artists, and let alone critics and curators, I suppose, but to professionals?
Well, I mean, again, and it's more like you can be speaking to the past and the present at the same time. So that population is as much ghosts as flesh. And again, it's like really, well, specifically, you know, with artists that I have as friends, I consider there to be an extended form of dialogue, for sure. And it's something that I hold very dearly and feel quite lucky to have a community of friends who, you know, and we studio visits and discussions and provocations. And so, and of course, when you have those conversations, they tend to stick and resonate in the mind. So it's like, oh yeah, there's what, you know, that person said or whatever, and it's like, so these things, they kind of write themselves into the work, these kind of conversations in many ways. So.
And I suppose that's especially the case when you're in residency, or?
Yeah, it was, and it wasn't. I mean, there was I had a studio that was in the basement shop. So it was this subterranean space that was in this low ceiling. I think the height of the sculptures was determined by the height of that ceiling, that they would not, you know, rise above that. So it was actually quite I kept my practice, or the activity of my practice, quite private. But then, of course, Berlin is such a wonderful city for stimulation and the history of culture that is already in place there. And you can't help but being inspired at every turn of the corner, really. And then there are also the conversations surrounding culture that are so inspiring. So, and this would extend past simply talking with other artists. It would extend into just patrons at a bar, or the bartender, or there was such a wealth of information and such an amazing field of, I mean, culture is just so, it was just so present there, and also the dialogue surrounding it was quite rigorous. So this was a nice, I mean, and of course I was with my friend Kristen Horton for the most part of that year, and we took that as a prompt to engage in our own conversations, which would challenge notions of each other's practice in relation to what we were seeing and what we were reading and discussing, and yeah, so.
I'm not sure if one could apply the term post-studio to the experience of residency.
Yes.
But perhaps there's some kind of relationship to that, and it's often been used as a term to describe the way art has evolved over the last decade or so, away from studios, more into projects and curatorial relationships. Would you care to comment on that? Or?
Well, I do, to a degree, have post-studio envy. I'm actually, there's many times when I'm sifting through this, and the dust, and I can't throw anything away. It's like, it gets quite existential in here. So, it's like, actually, I'd love to. I'm not saying that it's out of the question, but yes, and in terms of residencies, I'd say that they don't really work. The one in Berlin was exceptional because it was for 1 year, but I was definitely a bit of a black sheep in terms of I was actually making work that was physical. And it seems like it's more catered to a notion of yes, production, choreography, an idea, and composing it from the as a projection. So it would, whatever that would be, its result would be, come out of the box or whatever. But I don't know. I had something else to say there, but it trickled away. But, anyways.
Okay. I want to come back to something you were saying earlier, which is about reading.
Yes.
And I'm curious to know just whether, obviously, you read theory, and I'm kind of curious as to whether your readings extend into literature and fiction, into theater.
Poetry is always a consistent force in my life, and in fact, as a adolescent, I was writing a lot of poetry, and was fortunate enough to be published in a few literary magazines. And so this was going back to this other question. I wasn't sure where the field of expression would actually end or begin or reside. But poetry is always I often just keep books around in the studio if there's a wall or if there's some kind of impasse, or I feel like my thinking has become static. I will often have things in the studio that I can just pick up and randomly access as a provocation. So, and again, like the Deleuze, but there's also, Pynchon, I feel like I need to look at my bookshelf. It's right over there.
Perseverance. Careers can be hard. They can be certainly a lot of work. And they're inescapable because as a professional, one is a professional because one has a career. However that's defined. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious, because it requires a lot of perseverance to pursue a career. Whether you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I just thank goodness this is not a career. And I would not consider this to be a job. I would consider it to be something that I attend to, and something that is just non-negotiable as a presence in my life.
Which brings me to the art system. And we all work within the art system somehow. Maybe we suffer through it, maybe we enjoy it. Any thoughts on the art system?
Yes, this is where you have to have a depth of strength in your constitution that enables you to survive. It's feast or famine, it's very fickle, and there's many moments where it becomes highly implausible to proceed, but somehow you find a way. And so it's this whole thing is I would just say it's just it's something you cannot count on or rely on, but it's there. Yeah. And it's something you can't it's something you can't ignore either. So you have to engage with this, of course.
And the engagements within the art system for an artist in Canada and an artist working in Europe can be quite different, or the United States.
Yeah.
Do you see any particular differences?
Oh yes, well I think we're extraordinarily fortunate here, and very lucky, and quasi-privileged. Especially being abroad on one of those residencies and seeing or hearing other artists from other countries and what's available as funding or as support, and it's very we're quite rich as and we have there's a great emphasis on supporting artists. I know obviously there's internal aspects of that are highly problematic.
Walter Benjamin has much to say about the ruin, and the degree to which that sense of collapse haunts them.
Mm-hmm. It's become like a real aesthetic force, in fact, and Ruskin actually, his whole idea of the ruin and in relation, but then in relation to the photograph, it actually has, it informs the subject of the photograph, and therefore has informed our idea of images and the picturesque, everything. There's a huge history of all of this that, you know, it's like inevitably we need to have the fly in the ointment to produce the provocation of beauty, you know, or to have the or just that punctum in relation to what can be defined as beautiful. So that's really not a very good answer.
I like it though, and I look around and I see flies in the ointment everywhere.
Yes, yeah. In fact, there was one work that I did in Berlin, and there was, I don't know, I must have been using something extraordinarily toxic, because I came in one day and there were 10 flies that had just collapsed around this. I think I was using some resin or something, and they were all around the sculpture. But I inevitably ended putting them into the sculpture itself. And I was very fortunate enough to have the National Gallery buy that work, but of course the flies had deteriorated by the time they were, you know, ready for the exhibition there. And but kudos to the National Gallery and their rigor. They actually got the same houseflies from Berlin and brought over or shipped over and replaced, because there was a specific iridescence to the Berlin housefly that was replicated and put into the work. So yeah.
Well, I couldn't assign my admiration to a National Gallery.
It's the conservative, yeah, the conservators there are quite astoundingly rigorous.
Okay, I want to come back to the question of the collector. We were just talking about the art system, and collectors are a signal part of that system. But are they necessarily part of your practice?
When you meet a great collector, it's like meeting a great American. They're great. They're fantastic. And when you engage with someone on that level of communication and resonance, it's to the point where they are willing to spend money on your work, and because they want to live with it, it's an amazing thing. When it occurs, it's a lovely thing, and I don't know. I feel like it's a gift when you are brought into contact with a great collector.
We're talking, of course, private collectors.
Private collectors, I think it's like just that someone who's driven by passion. It's like a parallel kind of passion.
Do you find that curators can be great collectors? That they're working for an institution, of course.
Yeah, in many ways, they're the ones that are, when it's the same thing, like when you're encountering a great curator, there's, and they're writing a larger script that they're putting you into. It's the same function that we talked about with the critic, and to an extent the collector.
We live in the 21st century and we have 21st century technology, and that technology has become part of our entire existence.
Mm.
Do you have any thoughts on the intersection of those technologies, there are several of them, with your own practice?
No, not really. I mean, I'm pretty lo-fi here. I kind of keep it a bit lo-fi. I mean, at least currently, right now, this is where it's just more of a hands-on, it's like a very direct, sensual encounter with materiality and its effects as compositions. So, you know, like, it's not something that I can project into a computer. It's not something that I mean, I would love, that's what I said, I have post-studio envy. I would love to do, you know, a rendering and then, you know, here, go make it. But of course, I can never, I feel like it's just I really enjoy the process of discovery of the evolution of the object in terms of its improbabilities. And those are things that I don't think you can actually, you know, negotiate in a digital realm. At least I couldn't. But it's not to say that I'm against technology or anti-technology in any way. You know, of course, I have done video works. I have done things like this. So it's an oscillating presence within my life.
I wonder if that brings up something. The last question I have is this. We have seen the question of authorship or originality called into question over the last several decades on a theoretical level. Though I'm not sure if that has extended to culture as a whole, but nonetheless, the digital realm has engendered a whole host of practices that would seem to resist or to stand apart from more antique notions of originality. And with that sort of thought in mind, naturally it seems we have to confront the question of authenticity and what is authentic. And I'm not suggesting that technologies themselves can produce inauthentic work, but
No.
But the question of authenticity has surely shifted. And I wonder whether you have any thought yourself about what would constitute authenticity currently.
I guess there's a kind of comfort in the physical presence of things as much as it can be an albatross. But it's like there's the reality of an untraceable line of thought that exists in the object that could not be reconstructed. There's the reality of its material dimensions and its improbabilities in terms of how things go together or what goes together. Authenticity and in fact there's many aspects of this work that drives me nuts because it does feel too sincere. And I almost want to, veil it. I like the quote from Brugtair when he shifted from being a poet to a visual artist, and he said, suddenly, the idea of developing something insincere dawned upon me. And I was like, this is magnificent.